I was 3 days out of a triple bypass surgery, still hooked to monitors in a hospital bed, when my neighbor Wendell texted me a photograph that made my hand shake worse than the surgery itself had. It was a photo of my own truck, the dark green Ford I'd owned for 11 years, the one I'd rebuilt the transmission on myself in my own driveway 2 summers earlier, parked in a stranger's driveway 3 streets over from my house, with a "just bought" sign still taped to the back windshield.
My son had sold my truck. While I was recovering from open heart surgery, unable to so much as sit up without help, my own son had walked into a dealership, claimed authority he didn't have, and sold the one thing in my life I told him more than once meant more to me than almost anything else I owned.
I want to tell you exactly what happened over the following 3 weeks, because what I discovered about the paperwork my son used to make that sale possible changed not just my relationship with him, but very nearly resulted in criminal charges. I ultimately had to decide, carefully and painfully, whether to pursue. My name is Raymond. I'm 68 years old, and this is the story of the surgery that put me in a hospital bed for 2 weeks, and the son who used that window of vulnerability to sell my truck out from under me, never realizing that the actual title, the legal proof of ownership, was sitting the entire time in a fireproof lockbox he didn't even know existed. If you've ever discovered, during a moment of genuine physical vulnerability, that someone you trusted had taken advantage of exactly that vulnerability, stay with me until the end, because this story goes somewhere I think will surprise you. And if these kinds of stories matter to you, hit subscribe, because there's more where this came from. Let me take you back to where this actually started, because the truck itself and everything it represented matters more to understanding this story than the sale itself.
My wife Deborah and I bought that truck together in 2013, not long after I retired from 34 years working as a machinist at a manufacturing plant 2 towns over. We bought it used, already 6 years old at the time, because Deborah and I had spent our entire marriage being careful with money, saving steadily, never buying new when used would do just as well. That truck became, over the following years, something considerably more meaningful than simple transportation. I rebuilt the transmission myself, taught myself through online videos and a considerable amount of
trial and error, spending most of one summer flat on my back underneath it in our driveway, Deborah bringing me lemonade and shaking her head at the state of my hands by the end of most days.
Mad, explain a bit more about that summer, because I think it captures something essential about who Deborah and I were together, and why that truck came to mean what it eventually meant to me. I'd never rebuilt a transmission before in my life, and I remember the specific stubbornness that took hold of me when the mechanic at the local shop quoted me a price that felt at the time like more than our modest retirement budget could comfortably absorb. Deborah, rather than telling me to simply pay the mechanic and save myself the trouble, brought home a stack of library books on
automotive repair and told me, with the particular dry humor that defined most of our marriage, "Well, Raymond, you've got nothing but time now. Might as well use some of it, proving you can still learn something new." It took me the better part of 11 weeks, working most evenings and every weekend, ruining 2 sets of coveralls and skinning my knuckles more times than I could count. But I got that transmission working again, and I remember the specific pride I felt driving Deborah to dinner that first evening afterward, the engine running smoother than it had in years.
Deborah passed 6 years ago. Breast cancer. A difficult 18-month battle that ended in a hospice room I still think about more often than I probably should. After she died, that truck became something even more significant to me than it had been before. one of the few remaining things in my daily life that's still connected directly to memories of her, since she'd ridden in that passenger seat on countless errands, countless drives to nowhere in particular just to get out of the house during difficult stretches of her treatment.
There's a particular memory from her final year that I think about every time I climb into that driver's seat, even now. Deborah had grown increasingly weak by that point, mostly confined to bed or the living room couch. But on the rare good days, when the chemotherapy's worst effects had temporarily receded enough for her to have some energy, she'd ask me to take her for a drive. No particular destination, just out past the edge of town where the road opens up into farmland and the sky feels larger somehow. We'd drive for 20 minutes, 30 on her best days, windows cracked even at
cooler weather, because she said the air helped her feel like herself again, if only briefly. I probably took her on 11 or 12 of those drives over her final year, and I remember each one distinctly, the specific quality of light at different times of day, the particular songs on the radio, Deborah's hand resting on my knee, the way it had for nearly 4 decades of marriage.
My son Kyle is 39 years old. I want to be fair to Kyle in telling this story, because fairness matters, and because I don't think what happened came from simple malice, so much as a particular combination of financial desperation and a troubling willingness to rationalize increasingly serious decisions once the first one had already been made.
Kyle's marriage ended about 3 years ago, a divorce that left him, by his own account, considerably worse off financially than he'd expected, a settlement that favored his ex-wife more than he felt was fair, ongoing child support for their 2 children, and a job in regional sales that had become increasingly unstable as his company went through several rounds of layoffs and restructuring. I helped Kyle financially during this period, more than once, small amounts here and there that I never fully tracked or discussed formally, the way most parents help their adult children through
difficult stretches without necessarily framing it as a running account.
I remember specific moments from that period that, looking back, probably should have concerned me more than they did at the time. Kyle called me one evening, about a year into his divorce proceedings, sounding more distressed than I'd heard him since he was a teenager, describing a specific month where he genuinely didn't know how he was going to cover both his rent and his child support obligations simultaneously. I transferred him $1,500 that night without much hesitation, the way any father would for a son in genuine distress, and similar situations repeated themselves.
with varying amounts, perhaps 6 or 7 times over the following 2 years. I never once resented helping him during that period. What I didn't fully appreciate until much later was how those repeated moments of rescue may have gradually shifted something in how Kyle viewed my resources, not as belonging separately to me, requiring his genuine request and my genuine consent, but as a kind of ambient safety net he'd grown accustomed to drawing from whenever his own circumstances became difficult enough. About 8 months before my surgery, Kyle moved back into my house. Temporarily, he said, while he got back on his feet financially. I want to be honest that I welcomed this arrangement at the time, genuinely glad for the company after years of living alone since Deborah's death, and genuinely wanting to help my son through what seemed like a difficult, if temporary, stretch of his life.
I noticed over those 8 months a gradual shift in how Kyle discussed money around the house. Small comments at first, mentioning that the truck's insurance seemed like an unnecessary expense given how rarely I actually drove it anymore, suggesting that some of my unused possessions might be worth selling to help both of us financially. framing these conversations always as practical, sensible suggestions rather than anything more pointed.
I remember one specific evening, about 5 months into his stay, when Kyle brought up the subject more directly than he had before, sitting across from me at the kitchen table after dinner, a legal pad in front of him with what looked like a rough budget sketched out. "Dad, I've been thinking about our overall financial picture," he said, using language that struck me, even at the time, as oddly formal for a conversation between father and son. If we really looked at everything between us, the house equity, some of the less essential possessions, maybe even restructuring how the retirement.
Accounts are positioned. I think we could actually put both of us in a much stronger position. I told him, gently but clearly, that I appreciated his concern, but that I wasn't interested in restructuring anything, that my finances, modest as they were, had gotten me comfortably through retirement so far, and I intended to keep managing them the way I always had. He nodded, said he understood, and the conversation moved on to something else entirely, though I noticed in hindsight that it was around this same period that his comments about the truck specifically became more frequent. I told him each time that the truck wasn't for sale, that it held meaning for me that went beyond its practical value, that I understood his financial pressures, but wasn't willing to part with something that connected me so directly to Deborah's memory. He'd nod, seemingly accepting my answer, though I noticed, in hindsight, a particular quality to his acceptance that felt less like genuine agreement and more like a temporary retreat, the kind of pause that precedes a different approach rather than actual acceptance.
My heart problems had been building for a while before the surgery itself became necessary, a series of concerning test results over about a year, medication adjustments that helped for a while before the underlying blockages became severe enough that my cardiologist, a careful, direct woman named Dr. Ashworth, told me plainly that surgery wasn't optional anymore, that the risk of waiting had become considerably greater than the risk of the procedure itself.
I went into that surgery about 2 weeks before Kyle sold my truck, a triple bypass that, while considered relatively routine by modern cardiac surgery standards, still involved a recovery period that left me, for the first several days, barely able to speak clearly, let alone manage any of my own affairs. Kyle visited the hospital regularly during those first days, and I want to be honest that his presence at the time felt like genuine care and concern, exactly what I would have wanted from my son during a frightening medical situation.
I remember, specifically, the morning of the surgery itself, Kyle sitting beside my hospital bed before they wheeled me back, holding my hand in a way he hadn't done since he was a small boy, telling me he loved me, that everything would be fine, that he'd be right there when I woke up. I believed him completely in that moment, and I want to be honest that some part of me still believes that particular version of Kyle's concern was genuine, even knowing what I know now about what he did in the days that followed. People, I've come to understand since all of this happened, are rarely simply one thing or another. Kyle's fear for my life that morning and his willingness to exploit my incapacitation 3 days later existed, somehow, in the same person, at nearly the same time, and I've had to make an uneasy kind of peace with that particular contradiction. It was during those first several days, while I was still deeply sedated and barely coherent, that Kyle apparently decided to act on a plan I later understood he'd been quietly developing for weeks, possibly longer.
Man, I want to explain, as clearly as I can reconstruct it from what I eventually learned, exactly how Kyle managed to sell a vehicle he had no legal authority over,
He'd found, going through some old paperwork in my house months earlier while helping me organize things, an outdated, durable power of attorney document from several years earlier, one I'd drafted after Deborah's death, naming Kyle as my authorized representative for medical and limited financial decisions in the event of my own incapacitation, a document I'd fully intended to update but had admittedly never gotten around to.
Formally realizing or revoking despite our relationship, and Kyle's financial reliability having shifted considerably in the year since I'd originally signed it.
Kyle used that outdated document along with her car dealership's relatively lax verification process for a private trade-in transaction to represent himself as legally authorized to sell the truck on my behalf. He told the dealership I was recovering from surgery and unable to handle the transaction personally. Technically true in the most narrow, misleading sense, while conveniently failing to mention that I had never actually authorized this specific sale, that the power of attorney document was years out of date, and that I remained at all times fully capable of managing my own affairs.
Once I recovered from the immediate post-surgical period.
The dealership, working with what appeared to be legitimate paperwork and Kyle's confident, prepared presentation, processed the sale for $8,500, considerably below the truck's actual market value, and Kyle walked away with a check that same afternoon. I learned later, through Preston's investigation, that Kyle had actually researched the truck's approximate value beforehand using an online valuation tool that placed it closer to $14,000, given its condition and the mechanical work I'd invested in it over the years, meaning he'd knowingly
accepted a price well below fair value, simply to complete the transaction quickly, prioritizing speed over any genuine effort to secure a fair outcome, even within his own flawed understanding of his authority to sell it at all.
Wendell's text arrived on my 4th day in the hospital, once I was alert enough to actually check my phone regularly. I remember staring at that photograph for a long time, my heart monitor's steady beeping the only sound in the room, trying to understand how my own truck could possibly be sitting in a stranger's driveway 3 streets from my house while I lay in a hospital bed, having never once discussed selling it with anyone.
Wendell and I had been neighbors for over 20 years, close enough that he'd noticed the truck's absence from my driveway almost immediately, and, being the observant, community-minded man he'd always been, had walked the neighborhood that same afternoon trying to understand where it might have gone, half expecting to find it simply parked somewhere unusual rather than genuinely sold. When he found it 3 streets over, that "Just Bought" sign still taped to the windshield, he told me later, his first instinct wasn't suspicion so much as confusion, followed quickly by a sinking recognition.
I called Kyle immediately. He answered on the second ring, and I could hear, in the particular careful quality of his voice, that he understood exactly what I was calling about before I said a single word.
"Dad, I can explain," he said. "I know it probably looks bad, but I was trying to help both of us. The truck was just sitting there. You weren't going to be driving anytime soon with the recovery you're facing, and I figured, with the power of attorney from when Mom was sick, I had the authority to make a reasonable decision on your behalf while you were incapacitated."
"Kyle," I said, my voice weaker than I wanted it to be, still recovering from surgery. That power of attorney was for medical decisions and immediate financial matters during an emergency. It wasn't a blanket authorization to sell my personal property whenever you decided it made sense.
"I really thought it covered this," he said, though something in his tone suggested he understood, even as he said it,
that the explanation was thinner than he wanted it to be. I was going to tell you once you were feeling better. I just needed to act fast because the dealership had a specific buyer lined up and I didn't want to lose the opportunity.
I want to be honest about what I felt in that hospital bed. Still weak, still recovering, unable to physically do anything about the situation from where I lay. It wasn't simple anger, not yet. It was something closer to a profound, destabilizing confusion. The specific disorientation of realizing that during the most physically vulnerable period of my adult life, my own son had made a significant, irreversible decision about something deeply meaningful to me, using paperwork I'd forgotten even existed, and had apparently planned to simply present it to me as a completed fact, rather than...
I didn't have the physical or emotional energy in that moment to fully process what had happened. I told Kyle we'd discuss it properly once I was home and recovered enough to think clearly, and I spent the remaining days of my hospital stay in a strange, unsettled state. Grief for Deborah's memory tangled up with a new, sharper grief about my son's judgment.
I want to tell you about something that happened about a week after I returned home, once I was mobile enough to move around my house independently, that changed the entire trajectory of how I approached this situation.
I keep a fireproof lockbox in my bedroom closet, a habit I developed after Deborah's death, when I found myself, in the disorienting months following her passing, needing to consolidate and protect important documents I'd previously assumed she was managing more carefully than I'd realized. Inside that lockbox, among other things, was the truck's actual title, the physical document proving legal ownership, still in my name, never transferred, never signed over to anyone, sitting exactly where I'd placed it years earlier, and crucially, a document Kyle apparently had no idea existed.
I sat on my bed, holding that title, understanding with growing clarity exactly what this meant. Kyle hadn't sold the truck through any legitimate transfer of ownership. He'd sold it using a lapsed power of attorney to authorize a transaction with the dealership. But the actual legal title, the document that would need to formally transfer for the sale to be entirely valid, had never left my possession at all. Whatever paperwork the dealership had processed, whatever they believed they'd legitimately purchased, existed in a strange legal gray area because the actual proof of ownership had never changed hands. I called an attorney the following day, a careful, methodical man named Preston Yates who'd handled some minor legal matters for me over the years, and I explained the entire situation. He confirmed what I'd begun to suspect myself, sitting on that bed with the title in my hands. The power of attorney document Kyle had used was, in fact, restricted specifically to medical decisions and emergency financial matters directly related to healthcare costs during periods of documented incapacitation, language that, upon careful legal review, did not extend to authorizing the sale of personal property like a vehicle. More significantly, Preston explained, the dealership's failure to properly verify and process an actual title transfer meant the sale itself was legally incomplete, regardless of what Kyle had represented to them or what check had already changed hands. You have real options here, Raymond, Preston told me during that first meeting. You could pursue this as a fraud case against your son directly, given that he misrepresented his authority under that power of attorney to complete a transaction you never actually consented to. Or we could approach the dealership directly, informing them the title was never legally transferred, and work to unwind the sale through more straightforward civil channels, treating it as an incomplete transaction, rather than pursuing criminal fraud charges against your own child.
I want to be honest about how difficult that decision felt. Sitting in Preston's office, still recovering physically from major surgery, now facing an entirely different kind of difficult decision about my own son. Part of me, the part still raw from the specific betrayal of having my vulnerability exploited during literally the most physically helpless period of my adult life, wanted to pursue this as seriously and formally as the law allowed. Another part of me, the part that remembered Kyle as a small boy helping me in that same driveway where I'd rebuilt the truck's transmission, wanted.
I decided, after several days of difficult consideration, to pursue the civil route first, informing the dealership directly of the incomplete title transfer and working to unwind the sale, while reserving the option of more serious action against Kyle, depending on how he responded to being confronted with the full legal reality of what he'd done.
Those 10 days between returning home and having that formal conversation with Kyle were some of the strangest of my entire recovery. Physically healing from major surgery, while simultaneously processing a betrayal that felt in some ways more disorienting than the surgery itself. I spent a fair amount of that time simply sitting in my living room, the truck's title resting on the coffee table in front of me like some kind of talisman, trying to sort through decades of memories of Kyle as a boy, as a teenager, as a young man, searching for some earlier version of him that might help me.
I want to tell you about that confrontation because it happened about 10 days after I returned home, once I'd fully processed the legal situation with Preston and felt physically and emotionally prepared to have the conversation properly.
I asked Kyle to sit down with me at my kitchen table, the same table where he'd eaten breakfast every morning of his childhood, and I laid out everything Preston had explained. The limitations of the power of attorney document, the fact that the actual title had never left my lockbox, the legal reality that the sale, as processed, existed in a state that could be formally unwound given the incomplete transfer.
I watched Kyle's face move through several stages as I explained this. Initial defensiveness, then a kind of dawning realization about the actual scope of what he'd attempted, and finally something that looked like genuine fear, understanding, I think, for the first time, that what he'd done carried legal weight considerably more serious than a simple family disagreement about property.
"Dad," he said, his voice tight, "am I going to be charged with something? Please, I know what I did was wrong, but I wasn't trying to steal from you. I genuinely thought I had the authority to make that call given the paperwork." "I haven't decided yet," I told him honestly. "What I need from you right now isn't an explanation of your intentions. I need you to help me unwind this sale properly, cooperate fully with the dealership and with Preston to make sure the truck comes back into my possession, and then we're going to have a much longer conversation about what happens after that."
I want to tell you what happened over the following 3 weeks, because the process of actually unwinding that sale proved considerably more complicated than I initially expected. The dealership, once informed of the title issue, was understandably concerned about their own legal exposure, having processed a transaction based on paperwork that turned out to be insufficient. Preston worked with their legal team over the following 2 weeks, and ultimately the dealership agreed to void the original sale, refunding the buyer their money and returning the truck to my possession, treating the entire transaction as void from the outset given the incomplete title transfer, a resolution that avoided the need for any criminal referral from the dealership side, though it left
them, understandably, considerably more cautious about processing any future transactions involving power of attorney documentation without more rigorous verification.
The buyer, a young man named Trevor, who'd purchased the truck in what he believed was an entirely legitimate transaction, was, understandably, frustrated by the situation,
though the dealership's refund resolved his most immediate concern. I actually spoke with Trevor directly during this process, apologizing for the situation he'd been caught in through no fault of his own. And I want to mention, because I think it matters to the fuller picture of this story, that Trevor was remarkably gracious about the entire situation once he understood the full context. An elderly man recovering from,
"That's rough, man," he told me. "I hope things work out with your son. Family stuff is complicated."
I retrieved my truck about 3 weeks after the initial hospital text from Wendell, driving it home myself for the first time since before my surgery, an experience that felt honestly more emotionally significant than I'd anticipated. Sitting in that driver's seat again, running my hand along the dashboard the way I had thousands of times before, understanding that this simple, ordinary act of driving my own vehicle home had nearly been permanently taken from me by my own son's decision. I sat in that driveway for nearly 20 minutes after parking, engine off, just looking at the house.
Deborah and I had bought together the same house Kyle had grown up in, and I felt a strange mixture of relief and lingering grief that I don't think fully resolved for several more weeks, if it's fully resolved even now. I want to tell you about the longer conversation Kyle and I eventually had, about a month after everything had been formally resolved with the dealership, because I think it matters more than the legal resolution itself.
I decided, ultimately, not to pursue criminal charges against Kyle, a decision I made carefully, rather than simply out of sentiment. Preston helped me understand that pursuing fraud charges would likely result in a criminal record that could seriously damage Kyle's already fragile financial situation and future employment prospects, consequences that, weighed against the fact that the actual property had been successfully recovered without permanent loss, felt disproportionate to what I actually wanted the resolution to accomplish.
What I did instead was formalize, with Preston's help, an entirely updated and considerably more restrictive set of legal documents governing any future situation involving my own incapacitation, a proper, current power of attorney with explicit, narrow limitations.
I also told Kyle something during that conversation that I think mattered more to him than the legal specifics. "Kyle, I understand you are under real financial pressure. I understand, in some distorted way, that you convinced yourself this was a reasonable solution to a genuine problem. But you made that decision while I was lying in a hospital bed 3 days after open heart surgery, unable to advocate for myself in any meaningful way. That's not a gray area. That's taking advantage of the most vulnerable moment of my adult life to solve your own financial problems. And I need you to sit
With the full weight of that, not just the legal technicalities of whether the sale was ultimately valid."
Kyle cried during that conversation, genuinely, in a way I hadn't seen from him since he was a much younger man. He apologized more fully than he had during our initial confrontation, acknowledging not just the legal overreach, but the deeper betrayal of exploiting my physical vulnerability, specifically because it created an opportunity his financial desperation had made him willing to take. At one point, he asked me directly whether I still trusted him, and I told him the truth, which felt important even though it was difficult to say out loud. Not the way I did before this happened.
I think trust like that has to be rebuilt slowly, through consistent behavior over time, not through a single apology, however genuine it feels right now. I'm willing to do that rebuilding with you, Kyle, but I need you to understand it's going to take longer than either of us probably wants it to.
I want to tell you about where things stand now, about 8 months after my surgery. Kyle moved out of my house about 2 months after our formal conversation, finding a smaller apartment on his own, taking a second, less prestigious but more stable job to supplement his income while he worked to rebuild both his finances and, I think, his own understanding of the boundaries that should exist even within a close, loving family relationship.
We still see each other regularly, and our relationship, while different than it was before all of this happened, has genuinely improved in certain ways I didn't necessarily expect. Kyle asks now, before making any suggestions about my property or finances. Entire experience genuinely changed something in how he thinks about the boundaries between helping a parent and taking advantage of one.
The truck sits in my driveway now, exactly where it belongs, and I drive it regularly, sometimes with no particular destination in mind, the way Deborah and I used to when she needed to simply get out of the house during her treatment. I think about that 4th day in the hospital often, staring at Wendell's photograph, understanding for the first time the specific, disorienting fear of realizing that vulnerability itself had become something someone I loved was willing to exploit.
If this story resonated with you, if you've ever discovered that someone you trusted had taken advantage of a moment when you were at your most physically vulnerable, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And if you want to know what happened when Kyle finally paid off his portion of the legal fees involved in unwinding the sale, and whether that process brought us even closer together, that's a story too. Let me know.
One last thought before I close this out. Preston told me something during our final meeting that I've carried with me since. "Raymond," he said, "you'd be surprised how many cases like yours cross my desk every year, and how often the outcome depends entirely on whether someone kept a single piece of paper somewhere safe, years before they ever imagined needing it." I think about that fireproof lockbox often now, not just as a place where I keep documents, but as a kind of quiet insurance against exactly the moments in life when we're least able to protect ourselves. The surgeries, the
hospital beds, the periods of genuine helplessness that come eventually. For all of us. Whether we're prepared for them or not. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one.